sake. I'm working on it, folks. It's being difficult. Oh, God, they've changed it again. What is with these people? Why are they doing this to me? I'm working on it, folks. It's being difficult. Well, I'm in the right profile. There's no excuse for this. What is with these people? Working on it, folks. It's being difficult. Okay, I'm going to try one more thing, and then I'll be right with you. It's being difficult. I don't know what the problem is. Well, I do know what the problem is. The problem is Facebook keeps changing their interface. I give up. Anybody wants to do me a kindness? For some reason now, Facebook has suddenly decided it will not allow me to access the URL that I am generating with this live broadcast. So if anybody else can get the actual URL and post it on my Twitter page and my, well, you probably can't post it on the other tab page because Facebook locks people out of that, but you might be able to post it as a public thing. Because anyway, my personal page, that's what this is. So obviously it's available here. My author page and my Twitter page, I cannot post a URL to because I cannot get a URL. And there's no reason for that. It's always worked before just the same way every flippin' time, but now for some reason, it's decided not to work. No, it will not work. I have no idea why that suddenly changed again. I don't know. Anyway, hello. Good to see y'all. What can I say? The never-ending changes that happen on social media applications or sites or whatever you want to call them, just infuriating because you figure out how to do something and you're just trying to do it, and then all of a sudden it doesn't work anymore. Pretty much every other week something like that happens. Anyway, I'm not going to complain about it all night. I may be old, but I'm not that old. So, but there we are. So anyway, I appear to be here, and people appear to be able to see me here. So that's all good, and we will go from there. So it is Sunday. It is now 2:03 a.m. my time, Pacific Daylight. And I am going to be reading. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I need to fill you guys in on first. No, just working on a ton of stuff as usual. I am eyeball deep in Ostenard's stuff. As I mentioned before, last week, it's still pretty much the same thing. I'm trying to finish Navigator's Children, which is now the name of the 4th volume of my 4-volume trilogy. Meanwhile, Navigator's Children, what used to be the first half of Navigator's Children, which is now called Into the Narrow Dark, is currently out with various readers who are going to tell me all the things I've screwed up. And what else? Oh, and Brothers of the Wind is coming out in a few months, so I just got the proofs in on that. And we're working on the map and some other things and indexes and all that kind of stuff on Brothers of the Wind. So that's what's going on the writing front. Don't really have much else to say besides that. We're still, all of us, fairly healthy, and we are staying out of trouble. My cat has just gotten completely stoned on catnip, and she's just like collapsed here. She looks like a large fur-covered sack of laundry. But hey, nobody's judging here. Catnip is your thing. You go, girl. Anyway, so with no further ado, having given up on trying to post a URL on my author page or on my Twitter page because it won't work. God, these people irritate me. Anyway, so I am going to say hello to everybody, and then I'm going to start reading. So if I think of something else that needs to be addressed or mentioned, I will do so. So Wouter, good to see you. And playing COVID jab cab again. Oh, okay. So you're going off to get your shot. Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I hope everything goes smoothly. Holger, good to see you. Yeah, I can read a little louder. I can actually just put my microphone a little bit closer, or even, if necessary, crank it up a little bit. So don't be afraid to ask. Rosalba, lovely to see you. Hertie, good to see you. Olaf, good morning, my friend. Always a pleasure. Carol, hello. Good morning. Guten Morgen. Bon matin. James, hello. A lumbertad. Lumbertad. I am a lumbertad, and I'm okay. I sleep all day, and I work all day. Iris, good to see you. Who else is here? Jessica. Hello, Jessica. And Kristen, good to see you too. Ilva, thinking of me constantly these days. That's what happens when you allow a tad manuscript into your house. It gradually takes over. It eats smaller books. It makes itself comfortable. It is the equivalent, the book equivalent of the 600-pound gorilla. As in the old joke, where does a 600-pound gorilla sit? Anywhere he wants to. Same thing with one of my manuscripts. Christine, hello. Good to see you. And also a message from Petra as well. Lovely to see both of you. Or lovely to hear from both of you. Paul, beautiful sunny morning. I'm glad to hear it. It is so far still the middle of the night here, so it is dark. But the new pub dates for Last King correct? Olaf asks, meaning the new pub dates for the last two parts. As far as I know, yes, those are correct, although they will require some sprinting by me to get everything done on time. Who else have we got here that I haven't said hello to yet? Now everybody's just talking to each other. Mark, hi Mark, good to see you. I was just thinking about you the other day. And there is my dear mother-in-law, Hazel. Good morning, sweetie. Good to see you. I've been looking at all the cute baby pictures that have been coming over from your side of the pond. They're some very fetching children. If they're anything like mine, they will grow up to be hideous things that never leave home. But I hope you have better luck on your end. Hazel's not having babies. She's sending pictures of grandbabies and great-grandbabies. So what happened to my wrist? Oh, I have a permanent set of issues with soft tissue stuff and have since for like 30 years now. So sometimes it's just really sore, and especially if I'm holding a large paperback like this thing here, sometimes it helps just to have a brace on it. So thank you, Ilva, for volunteering to put the URL on. I appreciate that. And Leah, hello. Yes, those are the updates as far as I know. Sherry, good to see you as always. And who else is here? Billy, hello, Billy. And I think I've said hello to everybody who's checked in, so that's all good. Anything else? God, no. I am, one of these days, I'm going to get around to doing an additional broadcasty thing. It'll be shorter. It won't be reading. It'll be more, well, I might read some excerpts from things, but it'll be me talking about music and books and stuff that people might not have run across because they're not ancient like I am, you see. And once you get to be a very ancient person, you have a great store of wisdom. You see, that's what this head is full of. It is full of wisdom. I know it might seem like it's full of silliness and nonsense, but in fact, that's wisdom. You just don't recognize it until you get to be extremely old like me, and then you suddenly go, oh, all that crap that's been in my brain for years is actually useful wisdom. This is, of course, stretching the definition of wisdom very broadly, because most of what's in my head is like, baseball statistics from the 1960s and, the theme song to old cartoons and sitcoms and, all kinds of other crap. But I prefer to think of it as a lifetime of accumulated information. So there you go. Anyway, so with that, I think I'm going to start reading. As I recall, we were not in the middle of a section, but we were in the middle of a chapter, but I got to the end of it. Which is basically, because they had decided that the Eden children, Beric and Bryony, have been talking with the other nobles and have decided that if this army of the Twilight people is in fact coming toward Southmarch, that they should go out and meet them. And Beric has insisted that he should be the one on behalf of the family to lead it. And when everybody kind of is like, "What are you talking about? You're acting crazy. You're not a warrior. You're not trained. You have a crippled arm. Et cetera, et cetera." And Beric basically says, I understand I am not going to be the one leading the fighting, but it's important for the royal family to be there. But we also realize that Beric has ulterior motives for this as well. So that's what was happening in the section we just finished. Everything else is kind of work in progress. And so I will start reading and share it with you, the work in progress, as we go. So this is the beginning of a new section within the chapter. "Hoy, Chert, have you found that boy?" shouted a woman he only vaguely recognized. He thought she might be one of the Sandstones. The woman with whom she was gossiping on the front porch certainly seemed to have the huge sedimentary clan's telltale chin. "Not yet," he called. "Must that boom like the wind in the chimneys?" complained Beetledown from his perch on Chert's shoulder. If you're just tuning in, Beetledown, of course, is about this tall. "Must that boom like the wind in the chimneys?" complained Beetledown from his perch on Chert's shoulder. "Fair collapsed my head bones, that did." "Sorry." Chert was glad that he was far enough away from the women that they couldn't see the little fellow. Better to have them think he was talking to his own shoulder than to have every child in Funderling Town, and half the grown ones, chasing him down Gypsum Way in hopes of seeing a live roof-topper. "Are you sure you can't ride in the pocket of my tunic, where no one can see you?" "And where I can't smell nothing either." True enough." Beetledown stirred and sniffed loud enough for even Chert to hear. Turn, Chimook!" He drummed his tiny heels in frustration. "Where is the sun? Where is Sunwise? How can I say the turning?" "Left and right will have to do, because I don't think you know where the Stonecutter's door or the Silk Door are. You do know left and right, don't you?" "Course, but we call 'ems leaf and wreck when we speak thy tongue. So go leaf, left, what the will. But there, turn." Chert couldn't understand why the roof-toppers would use different words than everyone else did in a language that wasn't even their own. But it had long been clear that Beetledown had his own odd way of talking. Of all that small people, only the Queen could speak to Chert in a clear, civilized fashion. He wondered again why she spoke the language of the larger world better than her subjects did, but he didn't waste much thought on it. As they made a few more turns, Beetledown holding a lock of Chert's hair so he could stand up without tumbling as he sniffed the air, the odd pair began to move farther and farther from the center of Funderling Town. In fact, it soon became clear that Beetledown's nose was leading them toward the outermost reaches. If it was a true scent, the boys seemed to have gone by a rather circuitous route. But the overall direction was definitely outward and down. Thus, when they swung close enough to the salt pool, Chert turned and carried the little man into the great cavern. "Going wrong way, Art." "We'll turn back, but we need something. We'll be beyond the streetlights soon, and whatever you may have heard about us Funderlings, we can't see in complete dark." "Hoy! Boulder!" The small Funderling came bounding toward them across the uneven stones. eyes widening at what was no doubt the first adult person smaller than himself he had ever seen. He grinned in surprise and delight. "What is this, Chert?" "It's not a this, it's a who. Beetledown's his name. He's a roof topper. Yes, a real roof topper. You heard about Flint? Well, this fellow's helping me look for him. I'll explain it next time I come, but I'd appreciate if you'd keep quiet about it for now. Meanwhile, I'm going down Silk Door way, and I'll need light soon." "Just brought up a basketful for the second shift," Boulder said as he spilled out a selection of glowing coral. "Take your pick, and for free. I'm sure the story will be worth it." "Many thanks. And you just reminded me of something. Is Rock Salt here today with his basket?" "Just over there." Boulder pointed to a group of Funderling men and women, and even a few children who were sitting at the edge of the cavern near the great door, waiting for the afternoon shift leader to come for them. As he walked toward them, Chert finally convinced Beetledown to get into his pocket and hide. He fished out a few copper chips from his pocket and bought bread and soft white cheese from Rock Salt, as well as a water skin, which cost him a few more chips, even though he would be bringing it back to the peddler again afterward. Chert didn't like the expense, but it was becoming clear to him that he would not be back for the evening meal. This reminded him of something else. "Jasper, is your boy staying with you or going home?" he asked a man he knew, one of the fellows waiting to start an afternoon shift. "Home, of course. Earth Elders, he'd drive me mad in 100 drips if he came along with me." "Good." Chert turned to the boy. "Here, a little clay, isn't it? Pay attention. I'm giving your father this shiny chip, and if you take a message to my wife, he'll give that chip to you when he gets back from the pit tonight. Do you know my wife? Opal Blue Quartz on Wedge Road?" The boy, eyes very big at all the attention, nodded solemnly. "Good. Tell her I said that I may be gone a while searching and not to hold supper for me. Not to worry if I'm not back by bedtime even. Can you remember that? Say it back." His memory tested and approved, young Clay was dispatched, and Chert gave the boy's father the copper chip to hold in trust. "You've earned me a trip up to that fracturing big folk market, you know," Jasper said. "You'll want to spend it up there." "Do you good to get some fresh air," Chert said as he headed off across the uneven, rocky floor. "Are you mad?" Jasper called after him. "Too much of that wind will suck the life out of a person's innards." This was not an uncommon feeling among the inhabitants of Funderling Town, and although it might not completely explain why Chert was the first Funderling in centuries to meet a rooftopper, he reflected, it did explain why there hadn't been many other opportunities for such a thing to happen. They went out through the Silk Door, Funderling Town's back gate, a huge arch carved into a sandstone wall whose natural streaking of pink, ochre, purple, and orange made it look like exquisitely dyed fabric. Once through, they passed in a fairly short time from the careful delving and carving of the town into an area where no digging had been necessary because the underside of the mount was already hollowed out by the ocean and the drip of water from above into the limestone caverns. Although the Funderlings had enlarged many of them and created a network of tunnel roads to connect them all. What was not remembered, at least by anyone of Chert's acquaintance, was whether the strangely regular caverns below Funderling Town that spiraled deep down into the bedrock of the mount, down below the bottom of the bay itself, had always existed or had been created by even earlier hands. All that was known for certain by living Funderlings was that the mysteries were there, hundreds of feet below the heart of the castle's inner keep, and that the less the big folk knew about those secret depths, the better. Chert stood now far on the outskirts of Funderling Town, at the entrance to those very same mysteries, looking down at a long, creamy slope gated by two rock walls. At the bottom, was a scalloped fringe of pale pink and amber stone that glowed like a translucent curtain in the light of the torches that burned before and behind it. "This way? Are you certain?" Chert asked the rooftopper. Why would the boy have come so far into the earth, to a place he had made it very clear he didn't like? The Eden family tombs were 2 levels up from here, but that was really only a few yards overhead. "What my nose tells me be true," Beetledown said. "Stronger here than anywhere past thy home roofs and rookeries." It took Chert a moment to realize that this very little man meant that he had not smelled Flint so strongly since they had left Chert's own neighborhood back on Wedge Road. "Well, lead on, then." He made his way down the stairs that crisscrossed the pale slope and led ultimately into the first antechamber of the caverns. "Go leaf," announced Beetledown. "No, loft, that is what I mean." "Left? Why, that be him." They stepped out of the antechamber and beneath a low archway into the first of what Chert had known since childhood as the festival halls, a massive set of linked caverns full of columns and flowstone canopies that had begun as natural formations, but then been carved and decorated over the centuries until almost every piece had been extensively shaped. Only one extended section of grottos had been left untouched. Its name was a consonantal grumble in the old Funderling language that roughly translated as "the Lord of the Hot Whetstone's Garden of Earth Shapes." The carvings in the rest of the festival halls were as meticulous as anything in the wonderful roof of Funderling Town, but where the town's famous roof portrayed a riot of natural greenery, of leaves and branches and fruit, and also birds and small treetop animals, to a people who hadn't lived among such things in time out of memory, the festival halls were something altogether different. A collection of mysterious, endlessly repetitive shapes that made a person's eyes blur if he or she looked at any one spot too long. These had been done so long ago that nobody remembered whether earlier Funderlings had carved them, or why, and it was easy to see almost anything in the odd shapes. Animals, demons, portraits of the gods themselves. "I do not understand this place," said Beetledown in a voice so quiet and nervous that Chert could barely hear him, despite the immense silence of the caverns. "We're approaching some of the most sacred spots of the Funderling people," Chert said. "Very few others ever see them. It is one reason I wanted to hide you from others at the salt pool, to avoid someone making a stink if they found out where we were going." "Ah, yes." Beetledown's voice sounded a little strained. "Laws against it, then? Forbidden, eh? By us, with the great gable, or the holy wainscoting. Of course, with the holy wainscotings, none but the rats be small enough to follow us in." Chert couldn't help smiling. "Ah, I can see that would work in your favor. I suppose most of the big folk would have trouble making their way through some of the tight places down here, too. But you won't." He began walking again. "And it's not really forbidden for you to be in these places, but it's certainly unusual." "Just don't leave me here," Beetledown begged him, and Chert suddenly recognized that the undertone he had been hearing in the rooftopper's voice was pure fear. For the first time, he considered what it must feel like for his minuscule companion to come so far beneath the ground, away from the open roofs and sky. "Not even Beetledown the brave bowman can live long by himself in such a place," the tiny man said. "Not with the air so tight and close, and even one's breathing's so unnatural loud." "I won't leave you here." They crossed down through the festival halls and toward the cavern called the Curtain Fall, which was a side doorway to the great honeycomb of caves known as the Temple. But when first seen, it didn't look like the doorway to anything. At one end of the small cave, a broad sheet of water drizzled from a lip of jutting rock down into a pool. The waterfall shimmered blackly in the weak light of the cavern's single bracketed torch, although, as Chirp moved closer to the curtain of water, he could also see the pale reflection of his coral lamp move like a firefly across its surface. "Who comes down here so far to light torches?" Beetledown asked, distractedly sniffing. "You'll see." Chirp stepped out into the pool on a bridge of submerged stones near the edge of the cataract and headed straight for the falling water. "Don't drown us!" Beetledown chirped in alarm. "Don't fear. There is space between the water and the stone. And look!" There was more than space between water and wall. There was a hole in the great slab of stone, a hole that from most angles was hidden behind the waterfall. Chirp stepped through, taking more care than he normally would to avoid the edge of the waterfall, so that Beetledown would not accidentally be washed off his shoulder. On the far side of the water, they entered a single chamber, the size of an entire Funderling Town neighborhood, whose walls were lined with bracketed torches, and whose high ceiling was covered with the same kind of strange carvings that filled the garden of earth shapes. At the far side of this massive chamber stood the pillared front of the Temple of the Metamorphic Elders, cut directly into the living rock. "By the peak," the little man said in wonder, "one goes on and on. Have the Funderling folk truly dug all the way down in the dark earth and out through the bottom?" "Not quite," Chirp told him, looking at the intricately worked stone facade. Only the unevenness of some of the shapes showed that it had been a natural cavern once. "But we have found many of the deep places of the earth that water dug, then carved them even more to make them our own." Beetledown made a face, sniffed. "But for the first time I do not scent the boy strongly. One's track runs weaker here, behind the water wall." Chirp sighed. "I will ask the Temple Brothers anyway," he said, "but I'm afraid you'll have to wait here." "Are coming back for me?" "I won't go out of your sight. Just sit here on this stone." He placed Beetledown atop a relatively flat bit of carved wall, high off the cavern floor. He was glad he didn't have to go far. He felt a responsibility for the little man he had not expected. He remembered the tiny fellow's worry about cats and the joke he had made about it, and was again struck by shame. "It's true there aren't too many cats down here," he thought, "but I don't think I remembered to tell him that many here keep snakes against rats and voles and other vermin. I doubt Beetledown likes snakes any better than cats." He hurried across the wide floor of the temple chamber. It was here that the people of Funderling Town made pilgrimage, gathering on the nights when the mysteries themselves were celebrated, and for other important holiday observances. Chirp was relieved to see a dark-robed acolyte standing just inside the doorway of the temple proper, so that he didn't have to break his word to stay within Beetledown's sight. "Your pardon, brother." The acolyte came out into the full glow of the torches. The Metamorphic brothers did not use stone lights, considering them to be dangerously modern, even though the glowing lamps had been used in the streets of Funderling Town for at least 2 centuries. "What do you seek, child of the elders?" he asked. He was dressed in the temple's costume of archaic, loose-fitting clothes, and was younger than Chirp would have expected. He looked like he might be from one of the Bismuth families. "I am Chirp Blue Quartz. My foster son is lost." He took a breath. Here was where the trouble might really begin. "He is one of the big folk. Has he come past here?" The acolyte raised an eyebrow, but only shook his head. "Do not go away just yet, though. One of the brothers came back from the market and said he saw a Gajah's child." Chirp was not surprised to hear the man use the old Funderling word. He had spoken the common tongue of big folk, and Funderlings awkwardly, as though he didn't use it very often. The temple had always disliked change. I will bring him out. Chirp waited impatiently. When the other acolyte at last emerged, he confirmed that he had seen a boy much like Flint hours earlier, fair-haired and small, but clearly not a Funderling, in one of the outer festival halls, but heading away from the temple rather than toward it. Just as Chirp was absorbing the implications, he heard a clamor from behind him. 3 more acolytes, apparently returning from some errand, had stopped and clustered around the bit of wall where he'd left Beetledown. "Nickel!" one of them shouted to the first acolyte. "Look! It is a real living Gthunk!" Chirp cursed under his breath. Several more of the metamorphic brothers pulled out of the temple, some bare-chested and sweaty as though they had just come from forges, kilns, or ovens. Within moments, a dozen or so had surrounded the roof-topper. They seemed even more curious than he would have expected. Chirp waded through them and lifted the little man up onto his shoulder. Beetledown was looking a bit panicky. "Is he really Gthunk?" asked an acolyte, again using the old Funderling name for the roof-toppers, the little people. "Yes, he is helping me hunt for my foster son." As the other acolytes whispered to each other, Nickel approached, a strange gleam in his eyes. "Ah, this is a terrible day," he said, and laid both fists on his chest in a gesture of surrender to the Earth Elders. "What do you mean?" Chirp asked, startled. "We had hoped that Grandfather Sulphur's dreams spoke of a time still to come," said the acolyte. "He is the oldest among us, our master, and the elders speak to him. Lately he has dreamed that the hour is coming when Old Night will reach out and claim all the Dzedna." He used an old word that meant something like left behinds, "and that our days of freedom are over." The acolytes began to argue among themselves. Chirp had left Beetledown on the wall simply to avoid having to explain him and acknowledge the breach of tradition. But the metamorphic brothers' unhappy confusion was real and honest. "Will they kill me?" Beetledown fluted in his ear. No, they're just upset because the times are strange. Like your queen and her Lord of the High Place, or whatever it was, the one that she said warned you that some kind of storm was coming." "The Lord of the Peak," said Beetledown, "and he is real. The storm is real too, mark that. 'Twill blow the very tiles of our roofs out into darkness." Chirp did not reply, but stood, suddenly rigid in the midst of the tumult, like a traveler lost without light on one of the wild roads on the outskirts of Funderling Town. He had just realized where Flint must be going, and it was a fearful thought indeed. The snores of Finnith's husband seemed loud as the roar of his forge fires. "The clanging all day," she thought, then lying sleepless in the dark with him snorting like a bull all night. "The gods give us what they think fit, but what have I done that this is my lot?" Not that she had only complaints. Her man, called Unseen Oak Arms, was not the worst husband a woman could have. He worked hard in his little smithy, and did not spend too much time at the tavern at the end of the Drove Road. He was not one of the wasters, lolling on the bench beneath the eaves, shouting at the passers-by. If he was not the most affectionate of men, he was at least a responsible father to their son and daughter, teaching them to love the gods and to honor their parents, while hardly ever resorting to any punishment more painful than a cuff on the top of the head or the snap of his thick fingers against a child's backside. A good thing, too, Plymouth thought. He is strong enough to kill a grown man with those big hands. thinking of his broad back, and how the dark curly hair grew tight on his thick neck, the way he held up a bar that would be an ox shoe to show their son the color it should be when it was ready for shaping. She felt a little tickle of desire for him, snoring or no snoring. She rolled against his back and pressed her cheek against him. His sleep rumble changed. There was a note almost of question in it, but then subsided again. Their daughter Agnes stirred in her cot. To her mother's immense terror, both children had caught the fever that had lately passed through Candlerstown and all the dales, but although little Agnes had taken it the worst, her breathing had been almost normal again for a week. Zoria, the Queen of Mercy, it seemed, had heard Finneth's prayers. She was floating toward sleep, thinking of the damp straw on the floor that would have to be replaced with dry, now that wet weather had come, and of how she must also press Unseen to plaster up the cracks around the window of their little house, when she heard the first faint sounds. Someone shouted. When she realized it was not the watchman calling out the hour, suddenly all her sleepiness was gone. At first she thought it must be a fire. It was different living in a town than the village where Finneth had grown up. Here a fire could start so far away that you had never even seen the people whose houses it took first, but still come rushing down your own narrow street like an army of angry demons, jumping from roof to roof at horrifying speed. Was it a fire? Somewhere a bell was ringing, and more people were shouting. Someone was running through the streets calling for the Reeves. It had to be a fire. She was already shaking Unseen awake when she heard a voice louder than the others, perhaps at the bottom of their own road, screaming, "We're attacked! They're climbing the walls!" Finneth's heart lurched. Attacked? Climbing the walls? Who? She was heaving at Unseen's bulk now, but he was like a great tree, too much for her to move. At last, he rolled over and sat up, shaking his head. "War!" she said, tugging his beard until he knocked her hands away. "The Reeves are out! Everyone's crying war!" "What?" He slapped and pinched at his face as though it were not his own, then heaved himself up off their pallet. Agnes was awake and making questioning sounds, crying a little. Finneth pulled the child's blanket around her and kissed her, but it didn't soothe her, and Finneth had to see to Fergal as well. The boy was waking, but still half in dream, twitching and looking around as though he had never seen his own house before. For a moment, the sight of her confused children brought tears to Finneth's eyes. Unseen had pulled on his heavy breeches and, strangely, his best boots, but had not bothered with his shirt. He had his hammer in one hand, the hammer that no one else in the drove road could even lift, and an axe he was straightening for Tully Joyner in the other. Even in this wild moment, Finneth thought her husband looked like something out of an old story, a kindly giant, a bearded demigod like Hiliomedes. He was listening to the shouting, which had moved down to the end of the street. Now Finneth heard another sound, a raising wail like the wind, and she was filled with a helpless, sickening terror unlike any she had known. "I will be back," Unseen said as he hurried out the door. He did not kiss his children or wait for her blessing, which only added to Finneth's growing despair. Attacked? Who could it be? We have been at peace with Sutland since before grandmother's time. Bandits? Why would bandits attack a town? "Mama, where did Papa go?" asked little Fergal. And as she squatted to comfort him, she realized she was shivering, wearing nothing but the blanket she had wrapped around her. "Papa went out to help some other men," she told the children, then began to pull on her clothes. She couldn't believe that it could still be the same night, that only just the other side of the midnight bell she had been lying in her bed thinking about Onsin's snoring, worrying about the sound Agnes was making when she breathed. It was as though Perrin himself had lifted a hammer large as a mountain and brought it down on all their lives, smashing everything into powder. Candlerstown was aflame, but fire was the least of her worries now. The streets were full of shrieking figures, some bleeding, others only running, aimlessly mad, eyes staring wide and dark out of pale faces, mouths open holes. It was as though the earth had vomited out all the unhappy dead. Finnith couldn't think, didn't want to think. Such terror was too large to fit into one head, one heart, especially when she had to cling to a pair of frightened, weeping children and try to find a place where the flames were not burning, where people were not screaming. But there was no such place anywhere. Worst of all were the glimpses of the invaders. Impossible, nightmare shapes, clambering over walls and dashing across rooftops. Some in animal shapes, others bent and twisted as no living thing that could wear armor and carry a weapon should be. As she dragged the children past a public square, she saw a tall figure on a rearing horse in the midst of a crowd of Candlerstown men. And that figure looked so much like a man that for an instant she was heartened. Here was some noble lord, perhaps even Earl Rorik himself, a person Finnith had never seen despite his importance in her life. Yes, Rorik must have come down from his castle at Dalehouse to rally the frightened townsfolk and lead them against these monstrous invaders. But then she saw that this shaggy-haired lord was taller than any man, that he had too many fingers on his long white hands, and that his eyes, like those of his rearing horse, were as flame yellow as a cat's. As for the men around him, the ones she had thought he might be rallying, they were crawling and moaning beneath his horse's hooves as he pricked at them with his long spear, driving them like a flock of sheep to slavery or death. Agnes stumbled and fell, and Fergal began to shriek. She caught them both up in her arms and limped away from the square. She was in a part of town she hardly seemed to know at all, but everything had become something else on this ghastly night. It might be her own street, for all she could be certain, her own house that she staggered past as barking, whistling shapes came pouring out of the windows like beetles from a split log. Overhead, the stars had vanished. Finnith couldn't understand that either. Why were there no stars, and why had the sky turned that dull, dark red? Was it blood? Was the whole town bleeding up into the sky? Then she knew. It was the smoke of burning Candlerstown itself, hiding what was happening even from heaven. She found herself next in a crowd of people, although it was more river than crowd, a heedless wash of screams and waving arms that flooded down the marsh road past the Trigonate Temple. The outer walls and roof of the temple were crawling with something that looked like moss, but which glowed like sullen lightning. The priests had nearly all been slaughtered, although some of them were still crawling, despite terrible, obviously mortal wounds. In their haste to flee, the shrieking crowd was trampling the survivors, which might have been a mercy. Even Finnith stepped on a motionless human figure and did not care. It was all she could do to keep upright. She could not stop, could not turn, certainly could not waste pity on the dead and soon dead. She was hemmed in on either side, and all she could think of was holding Agnes and Fergal tight against her, so tightly that even the gods could not pull them from her. All who fell now were crushed underfoot. The crowd moved like a single living thing, rushing to the open east side gate and the darkness beyond, toward the blessed cold fields where no fires burned. Finnith ran until she couldn't run any farther, then shoved her way to the outskirts of the torrent of people, which was beginning to slow and scatter. They were outside the walls, knee-deep in the stubble of a harvested field, when she fell to the ground at last, exhausted and helpless. She wondered if she too might be dying. She was not wounded, but it seemed impossible anyone could experience such a night and live. She clutched her son and daughter and wept, every sob clawing painfully at her smoke-scorched throat. Gone. All gone. Onsen, her house, her few possessions. Only these two small, precious, panting creatures kept her from running back to throw herself into the flames of Candlerstown. Most dreadful of all, as she lay with her shivering children on the cold ground just outside their murdered town, she could hear the destroyers of everything she had, and they were singing. Their voices were painfully lovely. Darkness claimed her then, but only for a while. Chapter 28, Evening Star. White sands. See the moon scatter diamonds. His work is bone and light and dry dust in the garden where no one strays. From the Bonefall Oracles. She had lost track of how many different favored had taken her up, as though she were an ill-wrapped package, walked her to the next way station, and then turned her over to another functionary. But at last she was led into the receiving room of the paramount wife. Arimony looked up from her cushions and smiled indulgently as Quiniton abased herself. "Oh, do get up, child," she said, although she looked not much more than a girl herself. "Are we not all sisters here?" If we were all sisters, Quiniton could not help thinking, I wouldn't have gone down on my knees in the first place. The invitation had arrived that morning, and Quiniton had spent hours under the expert ministration of a half-dozen slaves, a mix of favored and born females, until her appearance had been polished to a blinding brilliance like a gemstone. After some consideration, she was then deconstructed and redressed in slightly less formal splendor. After all, we don't want the evening star to think we aspire to become the light of the morning, do we? A favored named Lucia had said with mocking severity. We shall be beautiful, but not too beautiful. Luyan, who had been a bit absent of late, as if ashamed of her part in bringing Quiniton to meet Jedin, had not been involved in the preparations for the audience, but she had sent one of her Tuani women to help Quiniton arrange her hair, which was now piled atop her head and held in place with jeweled pins. Quiniton had been quite taken with her own image in the glass when it was done, but that seemed like pure foolishness now. Arimony, who was perhaps 10 years older than Quiniton, was unquestionably the most beautiful woman she had ever seen or even imagined, like a temple image of Surigal herself, her hair jet black and so long that even in a braid it coiled like a sleeping snake all over the cushions on which she sat. Quiniton could only wonder what such an amazing cascade of hair would look like untethered and brushed out. She also felt certain everyone else who met Arimony, most assuredly including any whole men, were meant to wonder about that as well. The autarch's paramount wife had an arresting figure, small-waisted and wide-hipped, both features accented by her clinging robe, and she also had a perfect heart-shaped face. But it was her eyes, huge, thick-lashed, and almost as black as her hair, that made her look as though she belonged with the other goddesses in heaven, rather than languishing among mere mortals in the seclusion. Quiniton, who was already frightened and felt a bit of an impostor in her fine clothes, suddenly felt not like one of the all-powerful autarch's chosen brides, but like the dirtiest street urchin imaginable. Come, sit with me, Arimony said in a voice so light and musical it suggested years of exhausting practice. Will you take some tea? I like to drink it cool on days like this, with plenty of mint and sugar. It's very refreshing. Quiniton did her best to seat herself without tripping over any of the striped cushions mounted at the center of the room. In one corner, a young girl played the lute with surprising skill. Several other servant girls, when they were not waiting on the paramount wife, sat talking quietly in the corners of the room. Two youths, with the dewy, beardless faces of the favored, stood behind the cushions, waving fans of peacock feathers. The decoration of the receiving room seemed designed to remind visitors of one thing and one thing only, a bedchamber, which was, after all, the root of Arimony's power. She had not yet given the autarch an heir, but he had spent much of his first regnal year traveling through all his lands, so none of the other wives dared even whisper rumors of unhappiness in the royal bed. Should another year pass without sign of a male heir, of course, they would do almost nothing else. Forgive me for waiting so long before having you to visit, said the paramount wife. You've been here, what, half a year? More or less, Highness. You must call me Arimony. As I said, we are all sisters here. I have heard much about you, and you are just as charming as I imagined. She raised an eyebrow that had been plucked into a line as delicate as a spider's leg. I hear you are great friends with favored Luyan. The two of you are cousins, are you not? Oh, no, High Arimony. We are merely from the same neighborhood. The first wife frowned prettily. Am I so foolish, then? Why did I think she and you... perhaps because Luyan is a cousin of Jedin, the chief of the leopards. Arimony was watching her closely. Quiniton suddenly wished she had kept her mouth shut. She was even more disturbed to realize that she was still babbling about it. Luyan talks of him much, of course. She is very proud of him. Ah, yes, Jedin. I know him. He's a handsome fellow, isn't he? The evening star was still looking at Quiniton in a way that made her very, very uncomfortable. A fine, firm piece of man-flesh. Don't you think so? Quiniton did not know what she was supposed to say. The women of the secluded talked very frankly about men in a way that the virginal Quiniton often found embarrassingly informative. But this seemed somehow different, as though she were being tested in some way. A chill ran over her. But the paramount wife heard rumors. I have scarcely seen him, Arimony, at least since we were all children together. Certainly he could not be as handsome as our lord the autarch, all praise to his name. Could he? Her hostess smiled as if at a well-played gambit. Quiniton thought she heard a few of the slave girls giggle behind her. Oh, that is different, little sister. Sir Lepus is a god on earth, and thus not to be judged as other men. Still, he is very taken by you, it seems. The footing was again unsteady. Taken by me? You mean the autarch? Of course, dear. Has he not had you given special instruction? I hear that you are with that wheezing priest Panhissir almost every day. That there are prayers and rituals of preparation, arcane practices. Quiniton was confused again. Hadn't this happened with all the wives? I did not know that was unusual, mistress. Arimony, remember? I suppose it is not surprising that the autarch has become interested in something new. He knows more than the priests, has read more of the ancient texts than they have themselves. He knows everything, my oh so clever husband. What the gods whisper to each other in dreams, and why they live forever, the old forgotten places and cities, The secret history of all of Zand and beyond. When he speaks to me, I can scarcely understand him sometimes, but his interests are so widespread that they do not last for long, of course. Like a great golden bee, he moves from flower to flower as his mighty heart leads him. I'm sure whatever has taken his interest this time will be short-lived. Quiniton flinched, but she was puzzled and determined to find out why the other wives seemed to think of her as different. How were you prepared, Arimony? For marriage, I mean. If you will forgive an impertinent question, this is all very new to me. I imagine it is. You may not know, but of course I was married before. My current husband murdered my only child, then killed my first husband too, and made his death last for weeks, she did not say. Nor did she have to. Quiniton already knew it, as did everyone else in the seclusion. So my circumstances were a bit different. I came to our Lord and Master's bed, already a woman. She smiled again. We are quite intrigued by you, many of us here in the seclusion. Did you know that? You are? Oh, yes, of course. A very young girl. A child, really. Arimony's smile was a bit cold. From, let us be frank, an undistinguished family. None of us can quite imagine what it was that lifted you to the Golden One's eye. She spread her hands, which glittered with rings. The nails were half the length of her long, slender fingers. Other than the beauty of your innocence, little sister, which is, of course, charming and formidable. Never in her life, even standing before Autarch Solapus, had Quiniton felt less significant. Come, will you have a little more tea? I have prepared a surprise for you. I hope it will be a pleasant one. Will you promise not to tell on me if I do something that is a little naughty? Quiniton could only nod. Good. That is how it should be between sisters. So you will not be too shocked if I tell you that I have brought a man into my house today. A true man, not one of the favored. You are not afraid to meet a true man, are you? You have not been so long away from the streets of your childhood that you view them all as monsters and rapists, do you? Quiniton shook her head, confused and frightened. Did the first wife know about Jedin? Why else all this taunting? Good, good. In truth, he is very harmless, this man. So old that I do not think he could mount a mouse. She laughed between her teeth, and her serving girls echoed her. He is a storyteller. Shall I summon him? The question was not meant to be answered. Arimony lifted her hands and clapped. A moment later, a bent figure in colorful clothes stepped through one of the curtained doors and into the receiving room. Hasuris, she said, I apologize for keeping you waiting. I would rather wait for you in a dark alcove than be served honeyed figs by any other woman, mistress. The old man bowed low to Arimony, then gave Quiniton a look so saucy and self-satisfied that he might as well have winked at her. And this must be the young wife you told me of. Greetings, little mistress. You are a shameless flirt, Asuris, said Arimony, laughing. None of your nonsense, or the Golden One's guards will come, and you will join the favored. My stones and I adventure together only in memory, great queen, he said, so it makes little difference. But I suppose their departure could be painful, so I will stay silent and behave well. No, to behave well you must not stay silent at all. Instead, you must tell us a story. Why else would I have brought you here? To admire the turn of my calf? Wretched old fool. Tell us a tale. Perhaps, pondering, or pretending to, the paramount wife put a finger to her red, red lips. Even Quentin could not help staring at her like a lovesick boy. Perhaps the story of the foolish hen. And I think we're going to start there before we begin the story of the foolish hen. So, excuse me, I will be back tomorrow, well, today, later today at 7 p.m. for those of you who intend to hear both broadcasts. Those of you who don't, of course, as you know by now, probably all of you, except for those of you who might be listening who don't sign in. The show, the videos, the recorded version of these live readings is posted on, it's both available on my Facebook pages and on my Twitter page, and it is posted by Chris Fab on YouTube as well. So it is available, and I think it's also available on the tadwilliams.com site also. So, for those of you who will be back with me either 7 p.m., 7 p.m. Sunday, or next week at this same time, I thank you very much, as always, for joining me. For those of you who might have just popped in, I hope you'll come back and see us again and meet some of the lovely people who hang out here during the readings. And I urge you all to take good care of yourselves and to take good care of your loved ones, your neighbors, and in fact, human beings and animals. Well, human beings are animals, but human beings and other animals, because we got to take care of each other, because we're all we've got. So with that, I say good night. Thank you.